The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
St. Augustine is the oldest continuously occupied city in what is now the United States. The city was founded in 1565 by the Roman Catholic Spanish. If the Spanish had not sent Don Pedro Menendez de Avilés to Florida to eradicate the Protestant French people who were here, St. Augustine may have never been built. Fort Caroline was established in 1564 as a French Huguenot settlement on the St. Johns River near Jacksonville. This replica of the fort is in the Timucua-speaking Ecological and Historic Preserve managed by the National Park Service. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. When the French arrived in Florida to create a European settlement, indigenous people had been living here for 10,000 years.
Part of the reason the French select this area is because of the Mocamas. And the Mocama are a nation of Timucua speakers whose ancestors and predecessors had made this region into their homelands for thousands of years before the French arrived. They were a highly complex, interconnected nation, themselves comprised of towns, probably 10 to 20 towns, under the leadership of paramount chiefs, as we call them, or Oladakare and Timucua, who helped to kind of bring together this coalition of towns, especially for foreign relations.
I think when we think about northeastern Florida's history, we tend to think about the Timucua, but northeast Florida has an incredibly rich indigenous history. I think one that's kind of underappreciated and underpublicized. If we think about it, most people, their image of the indigenous people of our area is like a 5-year window into the lives of the Timucua in the 1560s, when in reality, indigenous people were here 10,000 or more years prior to that time and continued 150 years after that in northeast Florida and still continue to that today. So I think that one thing about this is that we really have this incredible history that we're trying to establish and for people to know about. So when we look at the 1560s, we really want to start looking at the history that led to that point in time and not just to focus on that little window. So we've done a lot of archaeology in this area to kind of really reveal that incredible history.
So on a day-to-day basis, most Mocamas lived in a community run largely by women. So households were run by women, who in turn made up the town, who was governed by either a male or female chief or Olada. There are, in fact, many women who ran towns at a political level among the Mocama. And these communities across sort of the region from north of St. Augustine to south of the Altamaha River were really woven together largely by women who created kinship ties across these communities. So they would come together for foreign relations, but on a day-to-day basis, really govern themselves as households and towns.
So really there's no people that are Timucua, it's a language that's a Timucua language, and then there are a series of dialects throughout the Timucua lands that are Mocamas, Wanampatanos near Gainesville. So really it's just a dialect of a much broader language. And sometimes we'll say Mocama just to provide a little more specificity that we're talking about the ones that are along the coast. Mocama actually means the sea.
They lived especially along the water. They're water people. The word Mocama means the sea. So they're people of the sea, but they were also the people of the marshes. And they had long had contact with outsiders. As far as present-day St. Louis, where Cahokia was in the 11th century, we know there was direct contact with our region too. So long had been part of this very dynamic, diverse indigenous world that involved religious exchange, political exchange. On the eve of the French arrival, the Mocama are interwoven into sort of a political landscape that includes both alliances within their nation and then also enemies outside of their nation. And it's into this sort of political environment that the French arrive, and this is why the Mocamas have any interest in allying with outsiders, is to help them foster their nation, protect their nation, take care of their homeland.
We know that the Mocama, this is their homeland. We know that it basically stretched from probably just south of the St. Johns River, probably to about the Satilla River in southeastern Georgia. We know that there was a series of towns that were there. We know the names of some of them, both the Spanish and the French accounts. Some of them, the Spanish accounts, are a little different than the French accounts. So we understand that there's this network of these towns that are kind of organized. They're in alliances. They're interacting sometimes as friends and sometimes as enemies with other Timucuas that are further, up or south along the St. Johns River. So we can kind of see their kind of relationships playing out in different ways, and the Spanish and French kind of become involved in that situation.
So the French first come in May of 1562. Briefly interact over the course of 2 days with Mocama leaders, especially one of the main leaders named Saturiwa, who took his name from his town, as was very common with sort of these higher level leaders. He was not only a political leader, but a military leader. The French come briefly. They also explore up to present-day South Carolina. They briefly establish a settlement at Paris Island. And then when they come back in 1564, it's expressly to come back here because they have had an okay encounter, complicated but okay encounter with Saturiwa. And they also believe this area is really rich in local resources and will be a great place to establish what is really a military outpost, then hoping to later on establish a colony. So they're coming intentionally to this area, and in large part because of the indigenous people who are already here, who seem to them to be quite wealthy. They notice a lot of gold and silver that Mocamas are wearing. Who also have a lot of food resources, so they hope that they can exploit that too. So that's why they're here, is because of the Mocama.
A group of French Protestants left France to seek religious freedom in the New World and also to make themselves wealthier. There was some of that motivation behind it, but to get out of largely Catholic-controlled France and have an independent colony.
The atmosphere in France was very, very tense because there were these new people who were breaking away from the church. They were Calvinists, but they were called Huguenots by the Catholics, I guess, which means conspirator. But at any rate, the king, who was 14 years old at the time, and his regent mother, Catherine de' Medici, decided that if they could get rid of some of those Huguenots, it would be very wonderful because they could kill two birds with one stone. They get rid of a problem, and then they'd have a presence in this new place that the Spanish were claiming was theirs.
They had arrived in 1562, the French had, and established the city of, the River of May. They landed on the 1st of May and called what we call now the St. Johns River, the River of May, and erected a monument claiming it in the name of France, so 2 years prior.
France is a rather temperate place, so they had to deal with the heat. They had to deal with the humidity. They had to deal with unbelievable amounts of insects, many of which I'm sure they'd never, ever thought of, and the animals that they had never, ever thought to see. As a matter of fact, there's some drawings of a possum which looks like some kind of gargoyle. It's just, they were really just amazed at what they found. And then, of course, it's really kind of sad because most of the Huguenots that went were artisans. They were not farmers. They were not hunters. So I think Laudonnière thought that they would do all their food gathering by barter. And that wasn't going to be a really good idea at all because the natives were just getting by as well. So
they brought people of many different occupations, but not many farmers. So they ended up here without a means by which they could sustain themselves. So they were very dependent on the Timucuan-speaking peoples.
So Timucua is the name of a language, not a people. We know that right before contact, there were probably 10 or 11 dialects of Timucua spoken. Mocama was one of those. And the total population of Timucuas was probably about 200,000 people, stretched really across the center of the current state of Florida, from the east even to the west coast. And they were organized into a lot of different nations. So the Mocama were one nation among many who spoke Timucua. And we call the Mocama Mocama. We don't know what they called themselves. So we call them by the name of their dialect to make it a little bit easier. Most Mocamas and most Timucuas probably mostly identified as members of their families or clans, which were run by women, and then members of towns, who were then grouped into these associations of nations, kind of like our states, the relationship between states and federal government.
Basically, we've established a couple of important things. We know what pottery they were making. We clearly understand as archaeologists that pots are not people, but at least this gives us a good marker. So if we find a lot of pottery that we know dates to this period, we can say that there's a larger settlement here. So I think 20, 25 years ago, we may have said it was another pottery type. Now we're clearly convinced of what it is. So we can establish where we find large amounts of that pottery, that's a community. And so now we're trying to correlate these areas that we find archaeologically with possibly known sites that are in the documents, known towns in the documents. And we feel pretty confident about some of them. We're not forcing our names on those. We've recently been working on Big Talbot Island here in the Jacksonville area, and we're fairly convinced we have the Mocama town of Sarah Bay. And in fact, we've even found a large structure out there that's more than 70 feet in diameter that we think might be their council house. So it's really nice to and date radiocarbon dates. We have some European artifacts that really are going to say that this site is probably 1580s, 1620 range.
We also know about them through Spanish and French records. And it's interesting because until recently, most historians who read records by the French and Spanish largely ignored all of the content about the Mocama. When you read the French themselves, their primary concern is indigenous people. They're very worried about the Spanish because they've invaded what the Spanish claim to be their territory. But once they get on the ground, they quickly realize that all of this space is owned by indigenous people. So they themselves talk a lot about the rituals, the ceremonies, the protocols of diplomacy especially. They talk about religion, they talk about how the Mocamas are organized, what they're eating, and do a lot of what we would think of as sort of early anthropological observations.
At first, the Timucuan-speaking Mocama people saw this as an opportunity. You could be an ally to me and an enemy to my enemies. And I think that the thinking was, with these arms that they had, that they would be a very powerful enemy against the Mocama's other groups that they were in conflict with. The French kind of promised their assistance with that, but never really delivered on it. So the Mocama people, they were not without agency. The French were very reliant on them for foodstuffs, and so they could withdraw that. They could choose to aid them, or if they wouldn't go along with their promises, they just basically left the area and left them to their own devices.
We also know about the Mocama through language. So there's a huge corpus of Timucua language materials that have only recently been translated. It's the second largest indigenous language corpus in the so-called colonial period for the present-day United States. It's second only to the Massachusetts language. So there are thousands of pages of Timucua text. That language is fascinating. It comes from Catholic texts, especially catechisms, but the Spanish component and the Timucua components are very different. And it's become evident that most of the Timucua components, and maybe even some of the Spanish, were written by Timucuas, especially Mocamas, where all of this language work happened in the early 17th century. So we have a lot of insight into Timucua families, into Timucua beliefs, their religion, their spirituality, their medicinal practices, their thoughts about women and children and warfare and hunting and fishing from these documents that are now being translated and made available.
So I think the French were trying to grab a foothold, an establishment here on Florida. The Spanish had been here, or at least they were in the Caribbean, they were in South America, they had made some inroads into other areas. So the French themselves wanted to basically make their presence known. So they established Fort Caroline in 1564. They had been here 2 years earlier in 1562 to kind of scout the area out. They ended up leaving their settlement at that time in 1562 at Charles Fort, which is in South Carolina, present-day South Carolina, Parris Island. That was short-lived. So they came back and they established another fort or garrison within an area that they had looked at before. They thought it was maybe a favorable area with rich resources around them. They seem to have had okay relationships the first time, so they basically tried to establish a colony here.
With the arrival of Ponce de Leon in 1513, the Spanish claimed all of the land that is now Florida and much of what is now the southeastern United States as their property. The Spanish were not happy when the French built Fort Caroline on what they saw as Spanish land. Since the French settlers were mostly Huguenot Protestants, the Roman Catholic Spanish considered them to be heretics as well as invaders. In 1565, the Spanish sent Don Pedro Menendez de Avilés to Florida to eradicate the French and establish St. Augustine as the first permanent European settlement in what would become the United States.
So the French come in the mid-16th century to begin to try to establish a foothold in Florida. The Spanish, since the early 16th century have been trying to do the same and have claimed without any lasting settlements that all of Florida is there. And of course it's not. It's owned by indigenous nations. The French come in 1562 and then for a longer period in 1564 in an effort to kind of get a toehold into what is fast becoming a competition between European empires, sort of early budding empires to control, especially the Circum-Caribbean. The French are most of all driven by a desire to find gold and silver. And they spend a lot of their time talking about that. They are Protestant, and so that's also an important component. These Protestants are very much wrapped in a warfare in France, an internal sort of civil war with Catholics. And this is an effort to really prove that they're French as much as anything else, that Protestants who are a minority and are being persecuted in France are also very French, and they too can help build the empire. And they want to build the empire by finding sources of wealth, which again includes silver and gold, but also indigenous bodies. So they spend a lot of their time not only looking for mineral wealth and pirating in the Caribbean, which is how the Spanish find out about Fort Caroline, but they also spend time kind of evaluating indigenous societies to see what kinds of labor they can extract from them and how they can slot them into the empire, especially as enslaved people.
We only know about that from one side. We know the French side of it, so it's probably exaggerated from that point. They seem to have an amicable relationship, at first, but it does kind of deteriorate through time. I think the Setarewa feel that they've established kind of treaties and that the French are not really fulfilling the terms of those treaties. They're backpedaling on things. They're not committing to the things. They're kind of giving them lip service on it. So I think after a while, the Setarewa and the other Timucua kind of start withdrawing any kind of support to them, and the French start to have a real rough time of themselves.
So the Spanish have long been trying to get a toehold into Florida and have increasingly become fixated on the Atlantic coast. Actually, further north, they initially wanted to settle in present-day South Carolina, sort of southern South Carolina on the coast. When they capture these French pirates, as they are pirating, having come out of Fort Caroline, pirating in the Caribbean, they commit to ousting the French. And so Pedro Menendez, who is a very famous pirate hunter, is put in charge of all of this. Initially intending to settle in South Carolina, but being pulled south by the presence of the French here. And so this is why he establishes this fort of St. Augustine in the area, but still intent at that stage on settling in southern South Carolina for the colony itself.
I think the Spanish felt that Florida and these areas were theirs. I think the Papal had established that, so they felt that any other European power who was on those lands was intruding. Also, Florida was a really strategic peninsula because it's right near the Gulf Stream, so all the ships that would be going out of Mexico or South America that may be laden with lots of gold, silver, other things come right along the Florida Channel. So if another power established a foothold there, they could kind of pick them off as they came by. So they wanted to make sure that they controlled it and nobody else.
When news reached Spain of a French incursion into their territory that they had claimed, they were very concerned. More so, I think, because they were Huguenots than they were French, or it could be equally so, but the fact that you had these Protestants staking claim to lands that you felt like you had already laid out as your own gave them immediate concern, and so they dispatched a fleet very shortly to take care of this problem.
They marshal a large armada. The armada sails into sort of present-day Jacksonville just after the French resupply boats have come. The colony has come under Ribault. There's a decision to withdraw. The Spanish go down to what becomes St. Augustine. The French respond under Ribault by sailing after them to try to attack them. And the whole time, Laudonnière, who's been in charge of the colony, this fortified, small, male-dominated colony, is saying, we can't even stay here. And this is a terrible time to sail. This is hurricane weather. And this is exactly what happens, right? The French, as they sail into St. Augustine, are hit by a hurricane, shipwreck. Menendez responds by leading his men through a hurricane up to attack Fort Caroline, which is already, half taken apart by this point. Its fort's already half demolished by the French themselves. Having really alienated the Mocamas do not tell the French that the Spanish are coming. Instead, they see this as an opportunity to let the Spanish finish the job that they've already started of getting the French out of their territory.
At the point that the French had been here for 2 years, they had decided they were going to be done with the place and had dismantled the fort and had built a ship to sail back to France. And just as they were getting ready to head back home, Jean Ribault showed up with reinforcements. And right behind him were the Spanish, the Pedro Menendez de Aviles, that the Spanish had sent to get rid of Fort Caroline. Jean Ribault knew he had superior numbers, so he decided that he would follow the Spanish down to St. Augustine, where they had taken their ships, and take advantage of the superior numbers. But he didn't know that a hurricane was on its way.
Really, the French at Fort Caroline were really had enough, and they were closing down shop. So they were starting to dismantle the fort. We don't know to what extent, but they're dismantling the fort. They're starting to build ships. They're ready to go. And right before this happens, Jean Ribault returns with a kind of a supply ship, and they weren't expecting this. So then they kind of resupply the fort. Ribault takes over command, and they want to stay there. And eventually the Spanish arrive a couple more days later, and that leads to this attack or assault on Fort Caroline by the Spanish.
So Menendez watches Ribault's ships get torn to pieces by the hurricane. He knew that Fort Caroline was unguarded, that most of Ribault's men who had been sent down to chase the Spanish were scattered about, all the way into Matanzas Inlet. Parts of them were at Cape Canaveral. So they marched overland to Fort Caroline, where they had a deserter who had led them right into Fort Caroline. And in the morning, they laid siege to Fort Caroline and dispatched most of the people they could find. They spared some women and children and a few people who were Catholic.
And I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize, and it's not kind of the mission of Fort Caroline Memorial, is that when the Spanish take it over, they actually occupy it for 3 years. So it becomes Fort San Mateo. So really the history of Fort San Mateo is closer to 3 years, while the history of Fort Caroline is only 15 months. And so it's interesting, when they take it over on like September 20th. And during that time, it was not the fort it had been, that the French had started to take it down. They maybe rebuilt it to some extent. So it really was not the stronghold that it had been. A few days later, the Spanish, when they take it out, they actually burn part of it down. So then they have to rebuild it. And one thing that they say is they rebuild it in the same spot. So we know that there is continuity between the location of the French Fort Caroline and the Spanish La Caroline, the Spanish San Mateo.
Congressman Charles Bennett, who was the representative of this district, had been a big history fan for a long time and wanted to recognize the importance of the French colony here. So in the 1950s, he got Fort Caroline National Memorial established by an act of Congress. So during the period between 1956 and 1966, what we call the Mission 66 period in the National Park Service, we had the fort exhibit constructed in our visitor center and maintenance facility.
So locally, people are really connected to Fort Caroline, right? It really grounds them to a sense of the deep past. And it's a really remarkable space. It's a place where a French colony briefly existed in the middle of an indigenous nation. We've only been telling part of that story, but when we tell the whole story, we learn a lot more about the French, about the Spanish, about why Florida was such a fixation for colonists, about why Florida continues to attract so many people and so much attention today. And in many ways, understanding these encounters helps us understand other early encounters too in the history of the United States. And when we include Indigenous people in that story, not only do we learn more about them, we learn more about everybody involved. And it really is in many ways the beginning of our roots as Americans. It's complicated, it's messy, it's violent, and it's important to recognize all of that. And the Mocamas not only weathered the French and navigated through that colonialism, but through Spanish colonialism too. I mean, their story doesn't end in the 1560s, it goes to the present day.
Although the exact location of Fort Caroline is not known, this replica of the fort in the Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve is maintained as a national memorial. The Timucua-speaking Mocama, who lived in this area for 10,000 years before the arrival of the French, are also remembered here. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime online at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.